This video was produced by the U.S. Department of Transportation's Office of Inspector General to provide government officials and the public with an understanding of common fraud schemes and to strengthen collaborative efforts aimed at prevention and detection. Each year, the department spends about $70 billion on transportation-related projects. Citizens have entrusted all levels of government to ensure that their tax dollars are being wisely spent on transportation infrastructure projects that enhance the safety, security, and mobility of the traveling public. We will continue to work together with our federal, state, and local law enforcement, prosecutorial, and transportation colleagues to maintain the public's confidence in the integrity of our nation's transportation system.
You're watching OIG Cable Television.
Today, up close and personal, fraud schemes and scams that cheat American taxpayers.
I call it a conspiracy. They all kind of get together to make sure that they can profit.
I said, destroy the unit or physically test it. They took a 30-pound chipping hammer and chipped away. It's the first time I've ever had to do it in my 21-year career.
There were numerous ways that the concrete did not meet Big Dig specifications. I don't think there was any secret about the practice within the company.
The taxpayers were defrauded.
Maximum penalty for each false statement that you make is 5 years in prison and a $250,000 fine.
Today, Eyes on Fraud Indicators will examine false statements, false claims, and fraud, which cost American taxpayers.
Now a message from the Honorable Calvin L. Scoville III, Inspector General, U.S. Department of Transportation.
Welcome to OIG Cable Television. A safe, efficient, and effective transportation system is vital to the national interest and enhances the public's quality of life today and into the future. The U.S. Department of Transportation, Office of Inspector General, seeks to advance this goal by working to promote program effectiveness and head off or stop fraud, waste, abuse, and other irregularities in departmental programs. We primarily do this through audits and investigations. But another important way to fight fraud is through increased fraud awareness. We view it as part of our responsibility within OIG to ensure that every DOT employee, grant recipient, and contractor, essentially anyone associated with the transportation community, understands what fraud is, how fraud can manifest itself through various schemes, and what the consequences are of fraud. This video programming is one way we fulfill that responsibility. Our focus today is on false statements and claims.
Today, examples of fraud schemes and scams found nationwide. Up close and personal in Michigan, where two firms violated disadvantaged business enterprise contracting rules. Up close and personal in Connecticut, where a supplier tried to pass off inferior products, costing taxpayers money. And you've heard of the Big Dig in Boston. Wait until you hear about this concrete scam. These stories next. But first, an exclusive up close and personal with the man who supervises these investigations.
No program at any level of government is immune to fraud, waste, abuse, or other irregularities. We at DOT's Office of Inspector General are working collaboratively with contracting officers, program officials, prosecutors, and others to stop individuals and companies from taking advantage of the public trust. An important part of this is criminal prosecution of those individuals and companies who seek to cheat the government through false statements, false claims, and fraudulent schemes. OIG employs various audit and investigative professionals, including criminal and non-criminal investigators, attorneys, and others. Our special agents spend a great deal of their time pursuing allegations related to contract and grant fraud, one of our top investigative priorities. But with so many contracts and grants and so much at stake, they can't do it alone. In other words, our preventing or uncovering fraud depends to a great extent on the cooperation we receive from others who know when individuals and companies are cheating or trying to cheat taxpayers.
The scene, Detroit Wayne County Metropolitan Airport. The need, major airport upgrades as part of federally funded construction contracts. The story, Ajax Paving Industries and Dan's Excavating bid on contracts as primes with a disadvantaged business enterprise, or DBE. That company, Borbola Construction, a concrete supply firm, was to perform part of the contract. That's where the details become fuzzy.
I contacted Barbola's office and spoke with his accountant. I asked her how many portable cement plants Barbola possessed, and she informed me that they didn't possess any. So then I inquired as to how many trucks they had if they were hauling concrete into the job, and she advised me that they didn't have any.
They basically were what we call a pass-through. All they did was process the payroll, so they really didn't even provide any kind of useful function. Basically, we call a brokering fee, which was about 5% that they provided when they're supposed to do the entire contract.
Barbola is a legitimate disadvantaged business enterprise and can do curb and gutter work on a shopping center or something like that. He did not have the capacity or the financial resources to do something so big as a runway.
The DBE, which is Barbola, the company, and Dan's and Ajax, the company, the people that run the company, they fully knew. I call it a conspiracy. They all kind of worked together to make sure that they, were able to get the contract and then fulfill the requirements of the contract.
The DBE regulations clearly say that if a DBE is going to participate in the contract, that they have to be responsible to do the work.
The investigation took approximately 6 months. The legal wrangling continued for about 2 years.
The contractor was offered the opportunity to negotiate a settlement, a civil settlement, which they subsequently agreed to do. They wrote a check to the Treasury for $11,750,000.
They also agreed to a corporate integrity agreement, which is very important because the company is now required, they had to hire an independent company, an individual to come in, and they cannot fire that individual. They have to pay that individual no matter what they come up with. And this keeps them honest.
The reason they were not suspended or debarred from participating on federal contracts, this was the first encounter with the companies. Of course, the contractor understands if they took a second bite at the apple, they'll have a whole different outcome.
If there is a civil settlement or a criminal action, the agency, meaning Federal Highways or Federal Aviation in this case, can debar that company for up to 3 years. It's much more of a significant hit to be debarred because that's 3 years, and that's quite a bit of money that they're going to lose out. They cannot compete for the next 3 years anywhere in the government.
The scene, the Big Dig in Boston, Massachusetts. The need, thousands of truckloads of concrete to complete the massive tunnel project. The story, between 1996 and 2005, Aggregate Industries Northeast, the largest asphalt and concrete supply company in the New England region, was awarded a multi-million-dollar contract to supply concrete to the Big Dig. Simple, you say, until the concrete was found to be substandard.
Several truck drivers, cement truck drivers, they came forward and filed the lawsuit essentially after the project was pretty much complete. Basically claimed that Aggregate Industries had defrauded the Central Artery Tunnel Project, which is known as the Big Dig colloquially here, and had falsified certain documents and provided substandard concrete.
The complainants alleged that the concrete was watered down, it was over 90 minutes old, it was recycled, and that concrete was delivered inappropriately.
Perhaps the most troubling part of the scheme was there were recipes for concrete depending upon the use of the concrete. What the Central Artery was getting as a mix was not what it was represented to be.
One of the things we found out was that the batch tickets were false, and if you looked at the batch tickets very closely and examined some of the information on them, an astute inspector could have probably figured out they were false.
Aggregate Industries was using old concrete and falsely representing to the Central Artery Tunnel that it met the specifications required by the contracts, when in fact it may have been a mix from a sidewalk pour where some contractor had only used half the cement, and then the cement was brought back to the plant and recycled as part of a central artery mix. I think everybody from the truck driver who delivered the concrete all the way up to the president of the company had an awareness of this practice.
The federal government did not get what they paid for. The public in turn did not get what they were paid for through their fuel taxes, and that's where the money comes from.
We have caused the company to repay $50 million, which is hopefully going into a fund which is going to be used by the Big Dig to continue to maintain the concrete structures in the Big Dig. And now they have a monitor in-house to ensure that that company maintains a corporate integrity compliance agreement, that they comply with all federal and state regulations. They were also divested of some of their corporate assets and had to terminate some of the employees who were involved in the criminal wrongdoing. They were also required to basically insure the project for up to $75 million in the event that there is some additional structural problem with some of the concrete structures.
I think cases like the Aggregate Industries case is an excellent deterrent for future white-collar construction frauds.
It was a fine example of various state and federal law enforcement agencies working together. The case was initiated by the whistleblower lawsuit. The investigators worked together to interview witnesses. Search warrants were executed, documents were seized, and ultimately individuals were indicted, arrests were made. That process took us about a year.
In the perfect world, this fraud could have been prevented if a very astute inspector had noticed the documents, the batch tickets were off, didn't look right. The trucks were lined up for longer than 90 minutes, and that trucks, there was hoses being poured into trucks to water it down.
A conspiracy is what it was, and if you get enough people in it that are basically lying to you, committing fraud, they can get away with it for a while, but sooner or later it catches up to them, and that's exactly what happened here.
The scene, the Bridgeport corridor of Interstate 95, Connecticut. The need, special steel reinforced drainage assemblies. The story, work on the Bridgeport corridor of Interstate 95 called for special concrete drainage assemblies to be installed to reinforce a bridge. A sharp-eyed project engineer became suspicious when she discovered materials that did not meet contract specs.
With this, United Concrete, because they were special units, we had to receive in what's called shop drawings or plans that would show how the fabricator would build the units. When we looked at the cast dates, they preceded the approval for the shop drawings that we did. That was the first red flag. The field inspector went to the resident engineer and said, "I think we may have a problem." I said, "Destroy the unit or physically test it." They took a 30-pound chipping hammer and chipped away at a little sump, and it didn't have any reinforcing in it. We notified the contractor, gave him a field directive, shipped the products out, and that just started the ball rolling. It's the first time I've ever had to do it in my 21-year career.
The specifications in the contract called for the assemblies to have the rods assembled in a certain manner. Obviously, there was a deficiency there.
United Concrete, the supplier, came, picked up the units that were delivered on site. All units that were dropped off were removed. They delivered another shipment. As soon as the shipment came, I didn't even look. I said, "Destroy the units," and they were no good too.
Each of the assemblies came with a pre-certification notice from the supplier, basically saying, yes, contractor, these products are made to your specs. One of the tip-offs in the case was the certification was signed by a dispatcher or a person who loads the trucks. Now, you don't have to be rocket scientist to figure out that the dispatcher was not in the manufacturing office, was not in quality control.
When we first met with United, they claimed that their truck drivers were picking up the wrong shipments.
So the first question there is, well, show us where the good ones were. You obviously had to have made them. Where are they? Obviously, they could not do that. They never made those. So, okay, we have another problem here.
Now, keep in mind, my project was a little bit different. We had increased reinforcing in our products, so for my project, it was site-specific. Our standard DOT products were being made to spec, but they found that they were using foreign steel. Keep in mind, because we accept federal money, we can't accept foreign steel in our products either. So our lab ended up shutting them down because of the use of foreign steel. So there's multiple things going on here now.
And we're able to demonstrate through records that United was aware of the special specifications for the projects, through correspondence from the company to the contractors.
The overall quality control at the United Concrete plant was not very controlled. We put them on suspension for a year. We inspected it. We didn't like what we saw. Off the job.
Then it was pretty clear that it wasn't a simple situation of, you know, we made a boo-boo, sorry. There was intent here. We don't prosecute boo-boos, we prosecute people that do things the wrong way. United agreed to plead guilty to making false statements with regard in connection to a federal highway project, and was through the plea agreement was sentenced to I believe a $500,000 fine, criminal and civil fine, and placed on 5 years probation.
These cases serve as a wake-up call to all government contractors who receive federal funding and to those government employees responsible for the stewardship and oversight of those funds. Thanks to the hard work of many parties involved, the bad actors in these cases have been prosecuted and held accountable in criminal and civil federal courts. DOT Office of Inspector General personnel are committed to uncovering other instances of false statements and claims like these in DOT projects. It's what American taxpayers expect and deserve.
Today on Ask the Expert, we talk to an expert or two who will provide legal perspectives on false statements and claims and fraud associated with federally funded transportation contracts. With us today is Omer Poirier, legal counsel for the U.S. Department of Transportation Office of Inspector General, and Raymond Hulser, who is the Deputy Chief in the Public Integrity Section of the U.S. Department of Justice. Welcome, gentlemen. Our first caller is already on the line.
What makes something a false statement that can subject someone to criminal prosecution?
First of all, the statement has to be false. Then the person making the statement has to know that it's false.
And that it's something that is submitted, it's a statement that's submitted to a government agency. And that statement also has to matter. It has to be material to something that the government is doing. If we have all those ingredients, then we have a criminal false statement.
Now, I've seen forms that warn you that making a false statement is against the law. But does there have to be one of those written warnings for there to be a false statement?
The reason the government puts those warnings on forms is because they're trying to encourage people to tell the truth and to discourage them from making false statements. But you're supposed to know that you can't lie to the government.
It does not have to be in writing, any oral false statement, and those are prosecuted routinely.
Now, I understand that you can be suspended and debarred for these crimes. Not being able to do business with the government is a serious consequence, but are there criminal penalties as well? What is the maximum penalty for an individual making a false statement?
Maximum penalty for each false statement that you make is 5 years in prison and a $250,000 fine.
It's $500,000 if it's an organization or company that commits the violation.
So, what is a false claim?
Well, a false claim is when payment is claimed from the government when the person claiming payment knows that they're not entitled to payment. People can claim that a product was delivered and seek payment for it even though it wasn't. Or they can claim that they delivered a certain amount or quality of product when they delivered less than they claimed or lower quality than they claimed. Another kind of false claim is when the contract itself was obtained through a misrepresentation. If the contract itself is false and obtained through misrepresentation, then all the claims for payment are false because they never should have had the contract in the first place.
What if someone makes an honest mistake, like a math error in submitting a claim?
You won't be prosecuted for making mistakes. You'll be prosecuted for knowingly and willfully submitting false statements and false claims.
What happens if the government sues someone for making a false claim?
There is a statute dealing with civil false claims, and that statute allows the government to obtain up to triple damages, plus up to $11,000 for each claim made.
What is the maximum penalty for an individual making a false claim?
That again is 5 years in prison and a $250,000 fine.
For a company, the fine can go up to $500,000.
That wraps up false statements and claims. What about fraud?
Fraud is a catch-all term we use to describe all these sorts of different conduct that involve submitting something false or deceitful or fraudulent to the government.
Is there a federal law against fraud?
There's not a federal fraud statute, but there are federal statutes dealing with mail fraud, if somebody uses the mails in committing a fraud scheme, or wire fraud, which is increasingly common because it involves not only using the telephone, but also using the internet or email, which you see more and more of now.
What are the penalties?
Those again are $250,000 fine and up to 20 years in prison. And the other thing that will happen, of course, with any criminal sentencing, if someone is prosecuted, is they will be ordered to pay full restitution to any victim of the crime, and that victim can include the government agency that was defrauded.
We have another caller on the line. Go ahead.
Does the defendant get a higher sentence depending on what statute the government picks?
In many cases, it won't matter which statute the government picks, so much as what will matter is the nature of the conduct itself. The sentencing guidelines that we use, the sentencing guideline that would apply to a fraud, false statement, or false claim crime are all really the same guideline. We call it 2B1.1. And in it, it has a chart. And in that chart are the dollar values of the fraud and the loss caused by the crime. That's what's really going to drive the sentence. It won't matter so much which statute